Wyoming Territory. Autumn of 1881, the wind carried the first bite of winter as it swept through the empty plains outside of Laramie. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the dry grass, and Priscilla Owens walked alone along the rutted wagon trail, a satchel over her shoulder and dust on her boots. She had been cast out that morning. "You are too plain to ever catch a husband, Priscilla. This family has no more room for your kind of dreaming." Her stepmother's voice had been sharp, final. Her father hadn't even looked up from his morning coffee, so she walked. She had no plan, just the ache of rejection and the firm belief that somewhere beyond the horizon, there had to be something more than being told she was not enough. By midday, her feet throbbed and her throat was dry. She had passed a broken fence post and a dead mule, long picked clean. The land was quiet. She kept walking. Several miles east, Gideon Darrin tugged the brim of his hat lower as he stepped out of his cabin. He was 32, alone, and tired of praying into silence. Widowed 5 years now, he had buried his wife and their baby boy in the same year and had not asked for much since except maybe, just maybe, someone to talk to who did not echo in the wind. He looked out toward the hills, then down at his rifle. He had work to do, wood to chop, cattle to check, and a busted fence to fix, but something tugged at him. An hour later, he saw her. She was walking slow, like someone running out of strength, her figure small against the sky. She almost collapsed when she saw the horse approaching. He pulled it to a stop a few feet from her. "You all right, miss?" he asked, voice even but concerned. Priscilla blinked at him, sunburned and unsteady. I do not know." He saw the way her shoulders sagged, the way her lips were cracked. She was no threat. "Just a woman alone with too much hurt in her eyes. You need water. Come on, I have a well not far from here." He reached down with one hand. She hesitated only a second before she took it. Her fingers were cold. Back at his homestead, he gave her water, bread, and a place at the table. She barely spoke between sips and chews. "You got people nearby?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "No, they do not want me." He raised an eyebrow. "Why is that?" "They said I was too plain. Not pretty enough to marry, not strong enough to work, just in the way." Gideon leaned back in his chair. He watched her for a long moment, then said, "They must be blind." She looked up, startled. He meant it. He saw the quiet way she carried herself, the care she took not to spill a drop of water from the cup, the straightness of her back even when everything else about her looked worn down. She was not weak, just tired. "You can stay here for the night," he said. "The barn's warm." "I'll set up a cot," she nodded, eyes wide and grateful. "Thank you." That night, as the wind picked up, Gideon tossed and turned. He kept seeing her, those eyes, that sadness. At dawn, he found her already awake, feeding the hens. "You did not have to do that," he said. She shrugged. "I like helping." By the end of the week, she had fixed his torn curtain, organized the pantry, and mended a saddle strap. He found himself looking forward to her voice, the way she hummed while kneading bread. She did not talk much, but when she did, it was honest. On the 7th day, she caught him watching her from the porch. "Do you always stare like that?" she asked, cheeks pink. Gideon chuckled. "Only when I do not know what else to say." She walked over, brushing her hands on her apron. "What do you want to say?" He stood. "That I prayed for someone like you." Priscilla blinked. "Why?" "Because I have been alone too long, and I think you have too." She looked at him, really looked at him. His face was weathered, his eyes steady. She saw the same sadness she carried inside herself. "I have not been wanted before," she whispered. Gideon stepped closer. "You are wanted now." Tears welled up in her eyes, not from grief but something gentler, hope. That night she stayed in the cabin. He made stew. She lit the lamp. They sat close, and when their hands touched, neither pulled away. It was not fast, but it was sure. By the end of the second week, she had unpacked the satchel she had never meant to unpack. Her dress hung beside his coat. Her hairbrush sat on the table near his comb. One cold evening, as the first snow fell, she looked out the window and said, "I used to think I was meant for nothing. But now—" He took her hand. "You were meant for this," he said. "For here, for me." She leaned against him, and for the first time in years, she smiled without doubt. She had been cast out for being too plain, but to Gideon Darrin, she was the blessing he had been praying for. The snow deepened in the coming days, reshaping the land into something hushed and clean. Priscilla had never lived through a high plains winter. She learned quickly how to bank the fire with damp ash, how to check the stovepipe for ice, how to wrap wool tight around her skirts when she stepped outdoors. Her hands chapped, but she didn't complain. Gideon noticed, though. He rubbed bare fat into her palms one night without a word, his touch careful, reverent. That morning, the wind had snapped the clothesline clean off the post. She'd gathered the flannel shirts and underthings from the snow, hung them by the hearth. When he came in from tending the cattle, he stood by the door, stamping snow from his boots and watching her fuss with the clothespins. "You ever lived near cattle before?" he asked, brushing his gloves off by the bench. "No," she said, pinning up a sock, "but I used to help with chickens." "And 2 goats, they were loud." He reached for the kettle. "We've got a Jersey cow due to come spring, might interest you more than goats." She turned, brow raised. "Does she let you near her?" "Only if I bring corn mash. She's vain." Priscilla laughed, a real sound, full of air and warmth. He looked at her longer than he meant to. She poured him coffee, sat across from him at the table. Outside, the wind moaned along the roofline. "I keep dreaming about the house I used to imagine as a girl," she said after a moment. "It had white lace curtains and a garden with herbs. I thought if I could just grow thyme and rosemary, I'd never feel lonely." "You ever plant anything from seed?" he asked. "No, there was never time." She traced the rim of her cup. "We weren't allowed to waste effort on things that didn't feed or clothe us." He leaned forward. "Well, come spring, we'll build you a box garden. South side of the house gets good sun." Her eyes lifted to his. "You'd let me do that?" "I'd help you do it." She didn't answer, but her fingers stopped fidgeting. The next day, the stove pipe jammed with soot. Gideon climbed onto the roof while Priscilla held the ladder steady. He didn't ask her to stay out in the cold, but she stayed anyway, wrapped in her shawl and humming something low and tuneless. When he came back down, soot on his cheek, she wiped it away with the edge of her sleeve. "You've got half the mountain on your face," she said softly. "Then I must have earned supper," he replied, grinning. That evening she made a venison stew with dried onions and turnips, thick and peppery. He ate 2 bowls without speaking, then leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "Been 5 years since I've had a meal that didn't taste like duty," he murmured. She reached for his hand across the table. "Been longer for me." He looked at their joined hands for a long time, then lifted them to his lips, just once. At night he repaired a broken rocker while she hemmed a worn flannel shirt. Her stitches were small, even. He didn't speak much while he worked, but she liked the shape of the silence between them, unhurried, easy. One morning, while splitting kindling, he caught her watching him from the window. She didn't pretend otherwise. "You're strong," she said quietly when he came inside. "Not just in your arms." He set the axe down. "You are too. Just no one ever saw it." "I think I did," she said, "but I kept doubting myself. Don't anymore." Later that night, he found her in the barn, brushing down the mare. She turned when she heard his boots. "I like the quiet here," she said. "No one watching for me to slip." He stepped beside her. "You can slip here, I'll catch you." It wasn't something he said lightly, and she knew. She stood still for a while, the brush idle in her hand. Then she turned to him, and whatever fear she'd been carrying around her shoulders seemed to melt. "I never thought I'd be seen as someone worth holding on to," she said. "You are," he answered. "And I mean to prove it, every day." She nodded once, and he saw the decision settle in her bones. The next morning, she didn't ask if she belonged. She just started baking a morning loaf and humming again while he brought in the wood. It was a new tune, and it sounded like home. By late January, the ruts in the road had disappeared beneath snow packed so firm it held the weight of deer. The sky had settled into a pale, colorless stretch, and the cold no longer felt sharp but deep, like it had settled into the bones of everything. Inside the cabin, Priscilla stood at the window with her fingertips resting against the glass, watching 2 magpies pick through the frost-hardened ground near the woodpile. Gideon set a tin box on the table behind her, the metal clinking softly. "Found this in the back of the loft," he said. "Figured it was just rust, but turned out to be sewing notions. Some buttons, needles, even a bit of ribbon." She turned, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. Ribbon, blue, faded but still strong. He lifted it from the box, letting it drape between his fingers. Thought you might like it. Her hands moved carefully as she took it from him. I didn't have things like this, she said, running her thumb along the edge. Not unless they were passed down and nearly threadbare. You could wear it in your hair, if you wanted, he said, voice quieter now. She studied the ribbon for a moment, then looked up at him. Would that please you? It would, he replied, but only if it pleased you first. She didn't answer right away, but that night, when she came in from feeding the cow, her hair was tied back with a simple knot of blue. He didn't comment, just glanced once, then twice, and went back to chopping onions with a steadier hand. Later, while the stew simmered, she said, You ever think about leaving this place? He looked up from the pot. Not since I buried them. Took me too long to get the house right again. Too many hours poured into fixing what was left, she nodded slowly. I don't want to leave either, but I used to wonder what else the world held. I walked for hours once just to see a river that curved like a snake across the prairie. It was smaller than I imagined. Things often are, he said. But they mean more when you find them alone. She leaned her elbows on the table. I didn't expect to find anything when I left. I just wanted to stop feeling useless. He stirred the stew once, then set the spoon aside. You're not useless. You've made this place feel like it's breathing again. The quiet between them thickened, not with discomfort, but with something unspoken that had begun to take shape. The next day, a stranger arrived. He came on a lean bay gelding, wrapped in oilcloth and muffled against the wind. Gideon met him at the edge of the property with his rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. Name's Tillman, the man said. I'm looking for a place to winter for a few days. Lost a mule crossing from Medicine Bow. Gideon narrowed his eyes. Ain't much here to spare. I'm not asking for charity, Tillman said, voice even. Just a roof and a corner of the barn. I'll chop wood, fix fences. Gideon glanced past him to the horse, saw the cracked hooves and sunken flank. You feed your animal first, I feed what works. That horse is all I've got. Gideon hesitated, then nodded. 3 days, you earn your keep. Tillman nodded once, then dismounted stiffly. Priscilla watched from the doorway, her arms crossed against the cold. As Tillman led the gelding toward the barn, she stepped aside for Gideon. Do you trust him? She asked. I don't trust anyone who arrives out of nowhere in winter, but I believe he's desperate. He looked at me too long, she said, voice low. Gideon's jaw tightened. He'll sleep in the barn. That night, Gideon kept his rifle leaned by the door. Priscilla didn't ask about it, and he didn't offer explanation. Her eyes told him she understood. By the second day, Tillman had kept his word. He mended a section of the fence and brought in a dozen logs without being asked, but he lingered too close when Priscilla carried out a pail of scraps. Gideon caught it from the corner of his eye. You got something needs tending? He asked Tillman sharply. No harm meant, the man said, stepping back. She's just a rare sight out here. Gideon stepped forward, slow and deliberate. She's not a sight, she's my partner. Speak to her like she's furniture again, and you'll be walking out of here on frostbeaten feet. Tillman didn't argue. He slept in the barn that night without coming near the house again. On the third morning, he rode off without a word. Priscilla stood beside Gideon as they watched him disappear westward. You didn't have to say all that, she murmured. Yes, I did, she looked up at him. Because of me. Because a man should know what lines not to cross. And you deserve to feel safe. She reached for his hand, not shy this time. I do, with you. A hawk passed overhead, casting a brief shadow across the snow. Inside, the cabin was still warm from breakfast. The fire crackled and the smell of rye bread lingered in the air. She walked ahead of him toward the hearth, and he followed, watching the blue ribbon swing gently at the nape of her neck. Neither of them said it yet. But it was there, settled in the quiet between them like something planted deep and beginning to root. The first thaw came early that year, running in slow trickles from the eaves and softening the edges of the snowdrifts. Mud clung to boots by mid-morning, and the air took on the scent of damp earth and old pine. Priscilla stood at the corner of the barn with her sleeves rolled past her elbows, a basket of potatoes beside her, and a knotted scarf holding back her hair. She was digging a shallow trench near the south wall of the house, the soil still tight but no longer frozen. I thought you might wait till April, Gideon said, leaning against the fence with his hands loose in his pockets. I don't mind if it takes time, she replied. I just want to start. He watched her a moment, then crossed the yard. You want it square or long? Long, she said, brushing soil from her palm. There's better light if it runs east to west. He crouched beside her and ran his fingers through the dirt. You know more than I thought, she smiled faintly. I used to read seed catalogs like they were storybooks. I'd imagine the rows and what they'd smell like in the sun. What'll you plant first? Chives, maybe mint if it takes. Mint'll spread, he said, glancing sideways at her. Could take over the whole patch. I wouldn't mind, she said. It's stubborn like me. He didn't argue. Just reached for the spade and began loosening soil near her feet. By sundown, they had shaped out a narrow bed with stones edging the corners. Her hands were raw, and his shirt clung damp at the back. They stood over it in silence, the sky streaked with copper and smoke-blue clouds. You ever think about marrying again? She asked, her voice low, his jaw shifted slightly. I've thought about what it means, not just saying vows, but choosing who you want to share silence with. She nodded once. I never expected to love anyone. I thought I might be useful to someone, maybe needed but not loved. He turned to her fully. I wouldn't have survived another winter alone, that's not just need. She looked up at him, steady. I don't want to be a guest here, Gideon, I want to be part of it, the animals, the land. He took her hand, the same one that had dug through cold soil all day. Then be here. Not just beside me, but with me. That night, she placed a small satchel at the foot of the bed without a word, its contents folded and worn. He added a second pillow to the mattress and lit the oil lamp lower than usual, casting the room in amber and soft shadow. They lay side by side, fully clothed, the quiet wrapping around them like a wool blanket. Her fingers found his beneath the quilts. You don't have to say anything, she whispered. I've said it already, he replied. Every day you stayed. The next morning, she was already outside when he rose, kneeling beside the garden bed with a tin pail and a handful of onion bulbs. He stood at the doorway, watching her bend to press seed into earth, her braid caught in the breeze, the worn hem of her skirt darkened by dew. He stepped down into the yard, boots sinking into soft ground. She looked up and said, We'll need a fence around this soon. Before the rabbits find it. I'll build one, he said. Something strong, she nodded, and her smile came slowly but surely. Good, because I plan to plant every inch. He reached for the hammer resting by the porch and walked beside her to where the posts would go. The sun crested the hill, and the wind carried the smell of thaw and wood smoke. The land, like their hearts, was beginning again. By March, the snow had vanished from the south-facing slopes, and the creek behind the pasture was running high and fast. Priscilla laid out her planting notes on the kitchen table, pages torn from an old ledger book, each marked with tidy lines and small sketches. She dipped the tip of a goose feather into the ink pot and made a careful note beside the date. Soil turned, onion set, fence complete. Gideon stepped in from the porch, pulling off his gloves. Trapper came by this morning, he said, setting down a small sack of dried apples. Traded me for one of the axes you fixed. She looked up from her notes. What else did he say? Said the trail to Elk Hollow's passable again. Mail wagon might start running before long. She folded the ledger page and set it aside. I'd like to write to someone, not family, just a girl I knew from back in Kansas. We worked the same dairy for a season. Then do it, he said. We can ask the driver to carry it. She hesitated, fingers resting against the soft linen of her apron. Feels strange, like I've stepped so far from what I was I don't know how to explain it. You don't have to explain it, he said. You just tell her how you dig in the dirt and bake your own bread and sleep in a house where you're wanted. She looked at him for a long time. Do you know how rare that is, that kind of belonging? He stepped closer, resting his calloused palm against her waist. I do now. The next week they hitched the wagon for the first time since autumn. The mare was sound, if a bit hesitant, and Gideon kept the pace slow as they made their way toward the general store some 8 miles off. It was the nearest place with paper, salt, and a place to leave a letter. Priscilla sat beside him, bonnet tied and hands gloved, her face turned toward the sun. She hadn't been into town since arriving, and the thought of it made her stomach tight, but she didn't say so. She sat tall, chin lifted. When they reached the cluster of building store, blacksmith, livery, and a church that leaned slightly to the west, Priscilla kept close to Gideon, but not in fear. She simply didn't know the rhythm of the place yet. Inside the store, the clerk, a thin man with a crooked front tooth, gave them a brief nod. "Thought you fell off the edge of the world, Darrin. Just stayed put," Gideon said. "Didn't see a reason to wander." The man's eyes slid to Priscilla. "She yours?" Gideon didn't look away. "She's mine and I'm hers." The clerk blinked, then shrugged and reached for the salt sack. Priscilla's fingers found Gideon's as they stepped outside, their palms pressed together in a quiet agreement. Back home, she hung the new curtain fabric herself, stitching it into the window frames with practiced hands. He watched her from the doorway, arms folded across his chest. "You always sew with your mouth tight like that?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Only when I'm trying not to make a mistake. You won't." "I already did," she said, pausing. Then she turned to face him. "I waited too long to believe I deserved better." He crossed the room in 2 strides and cupped her cheek. "You came when you were ready." "That's not a mistake." She leaned into his touch, eyes bright but dry. "I want to be your wife," his breath caught, but only for a moment. "I hoped you'd say that." They married in the pasture beneath a sky clear enough to see all the way to the Teton Range. The preacher from town rode out on Gideon's mule, bringing only a worn Bible and a flask of sweet wine. Priscilla wore a dress she'd let down herself, pale gray with a ribbon of blue at the waist. Gideon wore his best shirt, the one she mended with care. They said their vows with hands clasped and heads bowed. No crowd, no music, only the soft rustle of dry grass and the spring wind lifting the hem of her skirt. Afterward, they shared bread and jam in the kitchen, laughing when the rooster pecked at the windows. That night, Gideon took her hand and led her to the bed they now shared, not out of necessity but choice. There was no rush in the way they undressed, no uncertainty. They had built something slow and solid, and now they stepped fully into it. The fire burned low, and outside, the first frogs began to call from the creek. She lay with her head against his shoulder, fingers brushing the rise of his ribs. "I never asked," she said softly. "What did your boy's name mean?" "Samuel," he said, voice rough with memory. "It means God has heard." She pressed her lips against his chest. "Then maybe he heard us too." He wrapped both arms around her. "I believe he did." Years passed. The garden grew wide with chives and dill, mint climbing into the fence posts. Priscilla kept bees in a small hive behind the barn, and Gideon built her a drying shed for herbs and flowers. He carved her name into the beam above the door. They had 2 children, a girl with Gideon's eyes and a boy with Priscilla's quiet way of watching the world. They raised them on blackberries and fence mending, on songs hummed while kneading dough and lessons read aloud by lamplight. In the evenings, after the work was done and the children slept, they sat on the porch with a pot of tea between them and the scent of sage drifting up from the meadow. Priscilla never feared being called plain again. She had built something lasting, not just with her hands but with her heart. And Gideon, once hollowed by loss, now stood full and steady beside her, his days no longer marked by silence but by the quiet joy of being seen and loved and whole. They grew old beneath the same roof, the same patch of sky, with a love that had taken root and flourished, together always.